Is Sudan seeing a second uprising? Protesters take to the streets again, angry at the worsening economy. They accuse the government of failure. But can these protests lead to change this time? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I am Hashim Ahalbarra. Soaring bread prices led to the 2018 uprising in Sudan. Now, more than a year after the removal of long-time ruler Omar Al Bashir, the economic crisis has deepened. Prices have skyrocketed, food and fuel are in short supply, and unemployment has jumped. People are back on the streets protesting over their dire living conditions. They blame the transitional government for failing to revive the economy and accuse the army of expanding its power over most institutions. Hiba Morgan reports on the protest that took place on Wednesday.
Protesters in Khartoum and various parts of Sudan are commemorating the 21st of October, which marks the anniversary of the first Sudanese revolution in 1964. Now, the black smoke that you see behind me is the result of protesters burning tires to express their frustration at how this government has been operating over the past years. Protesters say that the economic conditions have been getting worse since this government took power in August last year. And they also say that the military is still in control of many institutions, something that they say goes against their revolution, which started in 2018. Now, protesters have been met with tear gas and stun grenades. Most of them have run away from where they are right now to just a little bit to where I was standing right now, and then back again. And they say that's because they do not accept this use of force by security forces. Now, many of them also say that they're not here to oust the government of Prime Minister Abdullah Hamdok, but rather to vent out their frustration and to put pressure on this government to try to improve the economic situation, as well as complete what they say is the demands of the revolution, which is forming a transitional legislative assembly and holding to account those who are responsible for killing protesters since 2018.
A joint civilian-military government has been ruling Sudan since Bashir was ousted. A military coup forced Bashir from power following months of major protests against his rule in April last year. A few months later, the military leaders agreed to share power with civilians until elections were held. A civilian prime minister was appointed and a time frame for appointing a legislative council agreed. An investigation was also set up into the killing of at least 100 protesters demanding transition to civilian rule after the coup. But that probe has been extended partly due to the coronavirus. Let's now get the thoughts of our guests joining us in London. Ahmed Soliman, he is researcher at Chatham House and specialist in the Horn of Africa and the Sudans. In Khartoum, Jonas, Deputy Director for Horn of Africa and Senior Analyst for Sudan at the International Crisis Group. Also in London, Marwa Gibril, she is Sudanese activist and member of the Sudanese Doctors Union in the UK. Warm welcome to you all. Ahmed, is what we're seeing now, this new protest movement, a continuation of the same pattern that has started last year, or is it different?
I think what we're seeing is different. I think what we had yesterday in the protests were broadly three different groups of protesters with differing sets of demands. You had more moderate revolutionaries from the FFC calling for, as your report put, the correction of the transition and to improve deteriorating economic conditions, to implement reforms to the security services and other institutions, and to implement justice reforms as well over a year after taking control. You also had a second wave of revolutionaries who were mobilized by resistance committees and the professional associations, and I think also influenced by the Communist Party, who were calling for the government to stand down, Prime Minister Hamdok. And thirdly, what we had was Islamist groups and supporters of the former regime mobilized from the capital and surrounds, some reportedly paid to come for protests as well. Again, protesting against the government, its removal, the removal of a secular government, and rejection of other issues such as the normalization of relations with Israel. So it was a different kind of demonstration, perhaps not as big as some thought it would be. And I think perhaps the government will be relieved that it wasn't an out-and-out rejection, and that the US state sponsor of terrorism delisting announcement this week may have tempered some of the hostility against the government.
Jonas, transitional periods are delicate and difficult. We've seen that in different countries post 2011. Arab Spring. But in Sudan, you get this feeling that the mistrust is deepening between the military establishment and the civilian groups, and this explains maybe what happened yesterday.
Yes, and I think perhaps that that relationship perhaps faces new headwinds in a way because of the recent clinching of the peace agreement in Juba, which brought in a lot of the most of the armed groups within Sudan, and that will have created a new set of dynamics in Khartoum. As you know, first of all, certainly the military has sought to get as close as it can to the Sudan Revolutionary Front, which is this collection of armed groups, and has sought to perhaps consolidate that small coalition of more militant-minded entities within Sudan against the FFC. The FFC, of course, had inked the constitutional declaration in August of 2019 with that same military, and many of the groups, particularly from within Sudan Armed Forces, but many of those from the old guard who were protesting yesterday, are very concerned, perhaps, about the emergence of a newly empowered margin. The Juba Agreement certainly empowers the margins in terms of wealth and representation quite considerably, and so that in many ways exacerbates some of the existing dynamics that you're referring to.
Marwa, one of the key demands of the protesters is the establishing of a legislative body as per the agreement that was made last year. Do you think that all the parties are genuine about the need of having that legislative body operating, including the military establishment?
I think as a part of the transition, I think I would say most parties, they do look forward to it. Not sure whether that will be the same case in terms of the period of transition, because the period of transition would have started from the signing of the peace agreement on the 3rd of October in Juba. So that will extend it to another 39 months and will give the military a longer period to rule. Definitely people are, I would say, political parties as well as people on the ground feel the instability that we have in different regions is because there is a lack of course, the form of legislative council, and there was a delay in naming the governors for the region. So I think one of the demands of the protesters, who I would say the group that Mr. Ahmed mentioned, is the group who are they see themselves as the guard of the revolution, or they call themselves the resisting committees. One of the main demands is to form the Legislative Council. We are expecting this to happen soon, because of course one of the things that was stopping the formation of the council is the peace agreement, and now it's already been signed. So the discussion there on on the way to hopefully see the council soon, which we hope that will take the responsibility of reforming a lot of those institutions that also the protesters yesterday or on the 21st came out to demand.
Ahmed, transitional periods are uncharted territory, and this explains why everyone is concerned about what might happen next. Don't you see this, the call for a legislative body being resisted by different groups, or at least by the military establishment? The reason being, the moment you have a legislative body, it would end up being the most legitimate organization in the state, and it will be the one with the ultimate say over many issues in the country. And this could explain why the military establishment is pretty much concerned about having a legislative council operating in Sudan.
Yeah, I think Marwa kind of eloquently explained some of the delays that have taken place with result to why the Legislative Council hasn't been formed yet. I think, we are fully expecting that during the transition, and particularly now that we, have the Juba peace agreement in place, and that some of the marginalized and armed forces will come into government, that we will see the Legislative Assembly formed. And I think you're right in saying that it will provide a check and balance on government, and it will provide a check and balance on the security forces as well. So I think this is an important body, and I think the need to establish it is as soon as possible is true.
Jonas, one of the other key demands is people are asking for the findings of the independent investigation into the breaking up of the main protesters' camp in Khartoum in June 2019. Now the government says, or the transitional authorities are saying that they had to extend the investigation because of COVID-19. Many people don't seem to buy into this narrative.
Yes. So in many ways, it is a very tricky question for the transitional government. On the one hand, the streets really demand to have a verdict in this, and there is a strong presupposition of guilt in many ways for the military, although people do seek the genuine conclusions of the commission that has been tasked with looking into that violence. But at the same time, the military, on the other hand, who have a real hold on the transition as one half of the hybrid transitional government, are very conscious about being labelled and being provided with culpability for the events, particularly on the 3rd of June. Mm-hmm. And they are very much capable of blowing this transition off course if they feel that pressure on their backs. And key here is that both General Hemeti of the Rapid Support Forces, and in some ways to a slightly lesser extent, General Burhan, who was the head of the Sovereign Council and of the Sudan Armed Forces, they're both working very hard to build their own political capital within this transition. And so a negative, a problematic verdict for them would really hurt their ability to retain social capital and the ability to compete politically or be a viable political presence going forward.
Marwa, we got an indication of how fragile is the makeup of the transitional government when the Prime Minister was talking about the need for a government oversight over the companies run by the military establishment. On the spot, we saw Burhan hitting back, saying this is a red line. Do you expect this to further continue to strain relations between both the military and the civilian components of the transitional government?
Right. So I think definitely there is huge challenges, formidable challenges this transitional government faces. One of them, of course, the relationship with the military component. And I think to many of us in the Sudanese, we know where the real power sits. One of the main problems, of course, that throughout the 30 years during the previous regime, there is a control over the economy, mm-hmm. And most of it, those companies are security companies, security forces companies. So there is a real challenge where it comes to the resources, or the monetary resources control, and the current government has no control over those companies. And unless, of course, there is a reform, which we think hopefully by the Legislative Assembly will start to pass laws to reform the situation through allowing those companies to be
to operate in a very transparent manner.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Then this would continue to be an issue, and of course we will see a huge resistance by the military component, because this is how they are controlling, of course, the whole economy situation in Sudan.
And since we're talking about the economy, Ahmed, we're talking about a country that is facing huge problems and unprecedented rising inflation, budget deficit, flood, rising prices of basic commodities. But still, you don't get a sense of what the government is willing to do. They seem to be very cautious when it comes to a genuine, dramatic reform and restructuring of the economy, because no one is willing to go that way.
Yeah, I think again this issue comes down to needing to balance the interests within the transition and the different transitional forces. You know, be they the cabinet, be they the FFC and the different groups that constitute the FFC and the revolutionary forces, and the military's interests, as we've just heard. So this makes maneuvering around economic reforms quite tricky, I would say. But nonetheless, extremely important. I think the Minister of Finance was alluding to the economic situation yesterday and talking about the SST list removal and saying that this isn't really going to lead to a quick improvement of the economic situation in the country. And really, we are talking about long-term structural reforms that are required to deliver improvements in living standards, to stabilize the economic crisis, to establish peace and kind of roll out federalism and institutional reform throughout the country. But in terms of the immediate, the here and now, I think there is also a behest on the international community, on partners who have agreed to support Sudan, including $1.8 billion worth of support in Sudan, in particular for the family support program to ease the conditions for the most vulnerable, which we're seeing, and your report highlights, worsening.
Okay.
So these funds need to be mobilized quickly to lessen the immediate economic pressures and support implementation of the peace agreement. So I think it's a matter of both domestic reform and international support.
Okay.
We're seeing some movement on one side and not as much on the other.
Jonas, with now the removing of Sudan from the list of sponsor of terrorism, could that be conducive in the midterm in more investments, debt forgiveness, a new environment that could encourage more people to invest in Sudan?
Absolutely. One of the most palpable impacts of being retained on that list of state-sponsored terrorism was Sudan's just general sense to others as a pariah state. And that did come with some legal strings attached, it's true, although most sanctions came off, most U.S. sanctions came off of Sudan in 2017, and yet still, the specter of SST has been held over Sudan. I would suggest that the immediate bounce, one would hope, and I think as Ahmed pointed out in his first response, one of the main early bounces was really was political for Prime Minister Hamidok, who really came into his office with the promise of being able to deliver on many of these promises from the international community. And I think the Prime Minister was not undue in expecting those benefits to come. But again, as Ahmed has just said, those benefits have not accrued. I think it has been a lack of belief in many ways from the international community in this transition, in part because they see the ongoing primacy of the military and their continued power and place. But as you say, in the medium term to longer term, this does provide Sudan with access, improved access to loans, to financing. The US and French have both said that they will convene conferences of potential investors, and the French certainly, and possibly the US, have said that they will write off the debt that Sudan owes to them. France was merely waiting for SST rescission before they had planned to do this.
Marwa, many Sudanese are concerned about the strings attached to the delisting of Sudan from the state sponsor of terrorism, and one of those strings are normalizing relations with Israel. Is this something that the government is willing to do during the transition?
Well, I think the government has been faced with this challenge, and I think a lot of Sudanese people feel the way the link has been made between normalization of relationship with Israel and delisting from the SST is made in a blackmailing way. And I think a lot of Sudanese, and I myself, think that Sudan should seek a relationship, international relationship with different countries, bent on what is good for the country, and not by force in any way,
Okay.
in a political moves by the United States. I think the probably, I would say, a lot of Sudanese will not feel that there is an issue in terms of normalizing relationship with Israel if it came willingly from Sudan and Sudanese people. And we don't think this current government has the authority to this transitional government has the authority to seek this kind of relation, and it should be left for an elected government through a popular assembly or the legislative assembly to whether to normalize or not normalize the relationship with Israel.
Ahmed, engaging with the armed groups for the sake of a peace that would last in Sudan paved the way to the deal that took place in earlier this month in Juba, except that the SLM and the SPLM-N are not on board, and these are widely seen as the most organized, well-armed groups in Sudan. Could that be a huge challenge in the near future for Sudan stability?
I think, the implementation of the peace agreement and sustainable social peace throughout the country is one of the biggest issues Sudan faces moving forward. You can see the peace agreement as a living document, as members of the government, including the Prime Minister, have said, and the first phase of bringing peace to the historically marginalized region and to the conflict zones. And as you say, there are important armed groups led by Abdulaziz al-Hilu and Abdulwahid al-Noor who are not yet included in the deal, but some discussions are taking place, including with the former. They have different tracks and they have different issues of importance. Abdulaziz al-Hilu in particular is very keen on provisions on the separation of religion and state, some of which are already included in the Juba peace agreement to an extent. But I think one of the things to say about this that's important is really the real dividends of peace mean beyond going assigning posts to the armed movements or to other elites. You have to deliver tangible improvements to security and livelihoods of people in the conflict region. And I think that will require a share of responsibility for implementing the peace agreement above, armed groups' own interests, and a commitment to devolve genuine authority to communities and people within those regions.
This is a country that obviously continues to face an extraordinary set of challenges, a fractured political landscape and huge economic problems. It will be interesting to see how things will unfold in the near future. In the meantime, Ahmed, Soliman, Jonas, Marwa, Gibril, I really appreciate your contribution and your insight. Thank you. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hashim Al Barra, and the entire team here in Doha. Bye for now.